Chapter 9, Hurricane Legend. With a leap, Nancy cleared the top of the concrete wall surrounding the crocodile pen. She avoided the swishing tail by inches. Joe shouted at the reptile in the Seminole language and prodded him with his heavy wooden pole. Finally, the creature became quiet, and the Indian hurried out of the pen. Nancy jumped to the ground, still trembling slightly. She looked over the wall and said, "Lord Charming, your manners are pretty bad. That was no way to thank me for the meat." Joe grinned. "Crocodiles aren't house pets, you know. I'm glad nothing happened." Bess spoke up. "You almost gave me a heart attack, Nancy. I'm sure I would have been too terrified to jump over that wall." George chuckled. "I'll bet you would have. But then, I doubt that you'd have gone into the pit in the first place." Joe stood shaking his head. "You're some girl," he said to Nancy. She smiled, then changed the subject. "Just before I threw that chunk of meat, I saw a man peering at me from among the trees. He didn't look one bit friendly." "That's strange," Joe said. "The only other person who works here is Eric, and he's not around this morning." "It wasn't Eric," Nancy said. "We met him the other day." "What did this guy look like?" George asked. "He had long black hair, small eyes, and looked like an Indian," Nancy whispered, not wishing to hurt Joe's feelings. "I'll search for him," Danny offered, and ran in the direction Nancy had indicated. Joe joined in the hunt, but both of them returned a little while later without having seen the stranger. "I noticed footprints along the shore," Danny reported. "They led toward the water. Whoever the man was, he wore a small-sized shoe with a rippled sole. When I reached the spot where the prints stopped, I saw a man in a small motorboat too far away to recognize. If he was the fellow who was watching us, Nancy, he's gone." Joe promised to look out for the stranger in case he should return. Then the young people thanked him for the tour of the zoo and went home. After a quick lunch, they set out in the skiff for Crocodile Island. "Do you think that man was spying on us this morning?" Bess asked while they were gliding along in the water. "Maybe he was a sneak thief who was trying to make off with something from the estate," Danny suggested. "When he saw us, he ran." "It's possible," Nancy agreed. "But it's more likely that Bess is right. He could have followed us from your house to see what we were doing." George looked behind them. "No one is following us now. Let's stop worrying about him." The young people once again passed the stilts with cottages built on top of them, and it occurred to Nancy that they might pick up a clue to Crocodile Island from one of the inhabitants. "After all, they live close to the place," she said. "Danny, do you think we might stop and call on the owners?" "Why not?" he replied, and paused at each cottage. He received no answer to his, "Hello, anybody home?" Finally, he laughed. "There aren't any boats tied up at the posts. Obviously, no one is here." As they passed a group of posts with nothing on them, Bess shivered. "Every time I think about a cottage being blown away in a hurricane, I worry about whether people were in it or not." "I never heard of any," Danny said. "But did you know that crocodiles were blown here by hurricanes?" The girls laughed, and George said, "Don't kid us." "I'm not kidding," Danny replied. "The story comes from the Indians. They say that when the Seminoles arrived here many, many years ago, there were plenty of alligators, but no crocodiles. Then, after a terrific hurricane, crocodiles were seen along the shore of Key Biscayne." Nancy, curious, asked, "Where did the crocodiles come from?" "Supposedly from Cuba," Danny answered. "But they might even have traveled all the way from Africa." "Oh, yes," George said. "If I see that in a science book, I'll believe it, but not from hearsay." "Well, they got here somehow," Danny defended himself. "And certainly no one brought them. You figure it out." He sent his boat past the houses on stilts. The pirate had not gone far when he pointed out an uninhabited quay. "That's a good picnic spot," he said. "Friends of mine and I sometimes come here." George asked if he could go closer. "I see a green bottle floating towards shore. Let's pick it up." Bess saw a good chance to tease her cousin. She rarely got the opportunity. "Are you collecting old bottles?" she asked. "From here, that doesn't look very valuable." "Possibly not," George retorted, "but it's corked. Maybe there's something valuable inside." When Danny reached the spot, George got down from her chair, leaned over the gunwale, and grabbed the bottle out of the water. It was dark green and had no markings. She tried to uncork it, but at first the stopper would not budge. "I guess we'll have to take the bottle home and work on it with a corkscrew," Bess said. "Maybe not," George replied. She wiggled the cork from left to right, being careful not to break it. The cork loosened little by little. With one final yank, George pulled it out. She turned the bottle upside down. Nothing fell out. Then she held it up to her nose. "What does it smell like?" Bess asked. "Perfume?" "Nothing," George said, disappointed. "You might as well throw it back into the water," Danny advised. "I guess you're right," George said. "The whole thing was—" "Wait a minute!" She had given the bottle a hard shake and looked into it. "I see something inside," she said, excited. "It might be a note." Everyone watched breathlessly as George held the bottle upside down and continued to shake it. Finally, a rolled paper appeared in the long, thin neck. She reached in with one finger and gently eased the piece out. "What is it?" Nancy asked. George carefully unrolled the yellowed, crinkled paper. "It's a message!" she cried out. "Dated 20 years ago!" "What does it say?" Danny asked impatiently. "Captain Wayne," George read. "USS Venerable sank in hurricane off Argentina. 12 took to lifeboat. God's blessings." There was complete silence for several seconds. Then Nancy asked to see the paper. "I believe it's authentic," she said, after examining it carefully. "The paper is well preserved, and the cork was in tight. And down in the corner is a date. This was written 20 years ago." "Why don't we take the whole thing to the naval station at Key West?" Danny suggested. "They have all kinds of records there of old ships that went down in hurricanes." "Good idea," George said. She was about to roll the note and put it back in the bottle when Bess stopped her. "Don't do that," her cousin advised. "It was hard enough to get it out the first time. Shoving it back in the bottle won't make it any more authentic, you know." George laughed and slipped the message in her pocket, then replaced the cork in the bottle. "My dear cousin, you're right for a change." "I'm right more often than you want to admit," Bess said haughtily. Danny grinned and started the pirate's engine. Soon they approached Crocodile Island. The girls used the binoculars to search for the periscope in the deep green channel, but did not see it. They circled the island from a distance and noticed a sign at the landing platform. "No visitors today." "They're keeping everyone out," Danny said. "No activity at all. I wonder for how long." Nancy shrugged. "Let's just keep going around the island. Maybe we'll see something sooner or later." They had almost completed the second circle when they heard an agonizing cry from somewhere on the island. Yeah! End of chapter 9.